Come on, Tom, you're doing great. Randall felt a sudden urge to slam him on the arm but remembered the multitude of cuts the man had suffered and decided against it. He would have to make do with words of encouragement for now. Keep your dignity, just a little while longer. It's really the only thing you have control of. Make the call, then you can lose it all you want. Christ knows no one will blame you for that. Least of all me. Nor me, Israel chimed in. I'm even counting on it. Whitaker straightened himself as best he could. He even made a half-hearted attempt to smooth down his famous hair one last time. Okay, he said firmly and crouched down to pick up his mobile phone which was laid amongst the debris of the door on the floor by his feet. He dusted it off and began to scroll through the address book. Randall felt Israel move over closer to Whitaker and could just make out his heat haze of a form over by his shoulder. He was studying the lawyer's face who of course felt nothing of the demon's presence. The demon mused. Interesting. I thought this one would be a beggar and a screamer. Just goes to show you never can tell. Randall thought he detected the merest hint of disappointment in his colorless voice. Then Israel drifted away to the corner of the room to prepare to follow the phone signal as only his kind could once the all-important emotional connection was made between Whitaker and the errant McCulloch. Then he added with a definite hint of mournfulness. Shame really. I'm all for begging and screaming. Oblivious to half his audience, Whitaker found the number and hit the dial button that held the phone to his ear. It's ringing, he said hoarsely. Good boy. What should I say? Doesn't matter, Randall replied. Just say his name when you're sure it's him who's answered. Then you can give the phone to me, and I'll say something ominous. He added with a smile. Remember, it has to be McCulloch, Israel said from the corner. If one of those shit-eating god squatters with him answers, I won't be able to find him. He'll answer, just get ready. Randall told him. Although Israel was the real expert at this, Randall could already see faint tendrils of cold blue light emanating from the phone as its signal drifted off into the ether. He could hear the demon behind him purring softly in anticipation as it tried to tune itself into the energy signature it would use to find McCulloch. Randall had seen the little shit do this a couple of times before, both times with amazing success. It was all down to the emotional link between the two ends of the signal. He knew this whole thing would have been over the moment the demon found McCulloch if the creature could inflicted violence of its own. Israel would make the perfect assassin in that respect, no style or imagination, but still it did have unerring instincts in such things, not that Randall would ever admit it to Israel. Besides, he would be out of a job, dead in a New York alley all those decades ago. Whereas there were times when he wished that had been his final fate, but not today. Today he was enjoying this crazy afterlife of his. Come on, Israel hissed. Trouble? Randall asked. No, the bastard isn't answering. I hope he still has his phone. Give him chance, Israel. It is 4:30 in the morning, Randall said soundly. Sleep the damned, Israel said. And Randall liked the sound of that. Soundly slept the damned, until they are so rudely awakened. Larry McCulloch was pulled out of the best dream he had had in weeks. He was laid on a foreign beach somewhere hot, perhaps Greece, but it didn't really matter. What did matter was that he was surrounded by a bevy of scantily clad local beauties, and if that wasn't good enough, the best part was that he was being waited on hand and foot by that prick Lewis who he had running back and forth catering to his every whim, dressed in a winter coat and thick woolen trousers. The poor sap was almost drowning in his own sweat. He had just sent him off running through the baking sand to fetch him another ice-cold cocktail when a familiar ring-tone cut through the serenity like a knife. He tried desperately to avoid the inevitable rude awakening, but to no avail. 1 second he was on the beach, the next he was sitting up in bed in his freezing room in the safe house. Still shaking off the effects of sleep, he rolled across the bed and grabbed his mobile from the bedside table. Why the hell hadn't he turned the damn thing off? He contemplated doing just that when he was the caller ID flash up, Whitaker. Much against his better judgment he pressed the answer button, but he swore that if the arsehole just started babbling on about sharks and shit again he would bin the phone and buy a new one in the morning. Tommy? For fuck's sake, man, do you know what time it is? Silence. Larry covered the mouthpiece. Oh, for fuck's sake, he said to the empty room, then he remembered who was on the other end, and repeated it into the phone. Oh, for fuck's sake, Tommy? Still nothing, but the faint sound of breathing. Whitaker, don't start this bollocks again. He swung his legs over the edge of the bed. I know it's you, Whitaker, I can see the fucking caller ID. He shivered and grabbed the duvet with his free hand and wrapped it around himself. He moved his thumb to the end call button. Larry McCulloch, Tommy said almost mechanically. You are fucked. Tommy. What did you say? Then Larry realized Whitaker had used his full name for some reason. Ripples? The word gnawed at the back of his mind. He tried to dismiss it as tiredness. Ripples? Bullshit. There was a few seconds of silence again, and Larry was about to speak when Whitaker said quite formally, "Larry McCulloch. I've got somebody here who wants to speak to you." Larry's blood seemed to freeze in his veins as he heard the phone change hands. He was about to press end call when an American on the other end spoke. "Did you say your prayers tonight, Larry?" Then the phone went dead. Larry let the phone slip from his hand and vaguely heard it hit the floor a million miles away. He tried to swallow, but it caught in his throat. Then finally he just managed to croak out, "Oh, bollocks." Randall tossed the phone away and turned to Israel. "Well? Got him." Israel's shimmering form rose into the air, which was now thick with blue trails of light swirling around the ceiling and out through the window and off into the night. They were so vivid Randall himself could have followed them, although not with Israel's speed. He knew they would fade all too quickly now that the connection was broken. The demon hovered close to the ceiling, letting the light show wrap itself around him as he orientated himself to the direction it was leading. "Oh, yes, I can use this," Israel purred. An instant later he was gone, riding the light stream like a roller coaster out the window and away. "I knew I kept that guy around for a reason," Randall said. The light was already fading fast, plunging the room back into near darkness once more. Whitaker of course saw none of this. "Is that all?" he asked tentatively. "Yeah. Not much to see from your point of view, but it was quite a show from where I'm standing." The lawyer looked around the room puzzled. A moment later Israel was back in the room, bouncing around like a demented ball of black energy. "Found him," he declared, and Randall caught a brief glimpse of his cat-like eyes as they flashed in the undulating heat haze that made up his body. "And he's only some 50 or so miles from here." "You sure you won't lose him?" Randall asked. He knew once the God Squaters learnt that Randall had contacted McCulloch it wouldn't take them long to figure out the old crook had been traced. "What if they move him?" "Ha!" Israel was as high as a kite, his usually vacuous voice definitely had a hint of excitement in it. In fact, Randall couldn't remember the last time he had seen the thing so worked up. He seemed to be enjoying this field work lark. "They could move him to the very gates of heaven and I could still follow. We have him, Collector, we have him." "Good shit," Randall said with a nod. He turned to Whitaker, who was looking at him, apparently talking to himself, somewhat perplexed. "Sorry, Tommy. Very rude of me. I was just discussing matters with my associate." "Don't you dare name me, Collector," Israel warned. "Not again." Normally that would be like a red rag to a bull to Randall, but he bit his tongue this time, not wanting to sour Israel's good mood. After all, the little shit had finally proved useful, and even demons deserve a break from having their balls busted once in a while. "Fair enough," he said. "I don't understand," Whitaker said with a shake of the head. "Right, let's be off," Randall said with a clap of the hands. He turned to leave when Israel came buzzing in his ear. Aren't you forgetting something, Randall?" He motioned to Whitaker as best as he could given his current ethereal form. "Oh, Christ, yeah." Randall spun back to Whitaker, who had been watching him open-mouthed talking to himself again. "Shit, sorry Tom. I'd forget my head if it wasn't screwed on." "Randall. Wait." Whitaker flinched but could do little else. "Listen. Not much for last words, especially coming from a man who had made his fortune talking judges and jurors alike senseless over the years. But his last they were." Randall moved with lightning speed, and before the lawyer could react he snapped his neck in one fluid motion with a practiced efficiency. It was all in the flick of the wrists. Whitaker's vertebrate snapped and part of the jagged-edged bone sliced right through his jugular and neck. A massive gout of blood painted the ceiling and far wall a shocking red as it jetted from the open wound. Whitaker let out a brief strangled cry before collapsing to the floor, where he laid quite dead with a look of shock of his face and his head twisted at an odd angle to the rest of his body. Blood was still pumping from the ragged hole in his neck, but with less and less force with each spurt as his veins emptied and his heart failed. Tommy Whitaker was dead, and it had been quick as promised. If not clean. "There's your blood, Israel. Happy now?" "At last," Israel exclaimed with as close as he could get to genuine glee. "A body count. Time, that great deceiver. One moment it moves like molasses. Minute hands on a clock face taking an eternity to rotate 360 degrees. Then, while your guard is down, just as you have settled into its hypnotic arms and let yourself be carried alone at its leisurely pace, in the blink of an eye it would flow like water through your hands, and no matter how you protested this sudden change it would slip through your fingers until, before you know it, it was all but gone." And so time had played its trick on Father Nichols over these last few days, lulling him into a false sense of security. It had slowed to a crawl, each minute seemed an hour, each hour a day. Until it had succeeded in convincing him it would stretch on for as long as he needed it to. It was something he had grown used to living in the bowels of the Vatican. For time there was a law unto itself. As when it wasn't standing still, could always be counted on to run so slowly as to make no difference. The place had stood for hundreds of years hardly changing much at all, untouched as it was by the outside world where time played mischief with stone and bone alike. When Nichols had first arrived back in England, he was still very much running on Vatican time, for he knew the bureaucratic wheels there turned as slowly today as they had down through the centuries, and as thus it was pointless to will them to turn any faster now that he was here in the outside world. He knew this all too well and had tried to prepare himself for it, but still now that he was out here he couldn't quite stop himself from fretting. After all, things were different when you were out here on the front line, out in the open and potentially at the mercy of God only knew what. Waiting as the cardinals met in dusty rooms taking their time as they always did to discuss the fate of others. But this time it was Nichols' fate they were debating, his and the other poor souls charged with the care and protection of the main topic of conversation, Larry McCulloch. But as the hours had stretched into days, time slowed out here in the real world too. And Father Nichols was its fool. Believing as he did in its promise of never-ending minutes, all the time he needed to save McCulloch from the darkness. 1 minute coming after the other until they made one bloated hour after another. For as long, it had seemed, the priest needed it to tick on. It was a seduction he willingly relented to. As the armies of damnation hadn't come to break down the door, to kill them all and drag Larry McCulloch off to the hell he so richly deserved. So the initial fretting had soon given way to unease, which in turn had soothed into a comfortable tedium. Nichols, without realizing it, had let himself be seduced into thinking, tick, as the saying went, would always follow talk, etc., etc. It was a nice dream while it lasted, but one from which Larry McCulloch had been quite literally dragged from no more than an hour ago. And thus Father Nichols had awoken to find that time had grown tired of sloth and had, on a whim, opted instead for warp factor 9. And performing a deft sleight of hand trick, time had all but run out in the blink of a bleary eye. And with it the sudden realization that time was now smoke, it had paralyzed his usually acute senses into numbing inaction. His mind was awash with a million different thoughts at once. Each vying in vain for his attention, but with such fury that try as he might he couldn't grasp one. All his semi-comatose state would allow him to do was just stand there with his heart in his boots looking out through a gap in the living room curtains to the approaching dawn outside, which was developing, as if for dramatic effect, into an ominous red color. Time was a slippery thing now, so he couldn't tell if he had been standing there, neither use nor ornament, for mere seconds or an hour or more. It was all a nonsense now, but he just couldn't drag himself away from the window.